This is my true story. I raised my son with everything I had. Long days, empty pockets, full heart. I believed that one day he'd make me proud, that all my struggle would turn into his success. But life has a cruel way of circling back. Years later, I sat in my living room, flipping through TV channels, and froze. On the screen was my son, the same eyes, the same face, begging strangers for money, saying he had no family left. My hand shook, my heart stopped. You won't believe what happened next. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I spent my entire life trying to build a future for my son. Every early morning began the same. The alarm clock ringing before dawn, the smell of coffee too bitter to enjoy, and the ache in my back reminding me of the years already gone. I worked 2 jobs for most of my life. By day, I lifted boxes in a warehouse until my arms shook. By night, I mopped the floors of a grocery store where people half my age laughed about weekend plans. I didn't complain. Every drop of sweat, every sleepless hour was for him. When my wife passed, I promised her that our son would never feel the kind of hunger or fear we did in our early years. She died holding that promise in her heart, and I lived to keep it. I sold my wedding ring to pay for his college application fees. I went without new shoes for nearly a decade so he could have good ones for school. I used to sit outside the local library while he studied inside, waiting just to walk him home. He'd tell me about his dreams, becoming a businessman, traveling the world, doing something that mattered. I listened like those words were gold. When he graduated, I felt 10 feet tall. Watching him in that gown, smiling proudly, I thought all my sacrifices had finally meant something. I remember standing at the edge of the crowd, clapping until my palms hurt, my throat tight from holding back tears. He looked at me once, waved, and in that small moment, I thought he'd never forget who got him there. After college, his life changed fast. He got a good job, moved into a fancy apartment, and started meeting people who dressed in suits and spoke with polished words. I told myself that's what success looked like. I didn't mind being left behind. That's what parents do. We step back so our children can step forward. I used to joke that I was his shadow, and shadows don't ask for attention. They just follow quietly. But as months turned to years, the distance between us wasn't just physical anymore. The calls became shorter. "I'll call you back, Dad," he'd say, and that call never came. I mailed him letters, small notes reminding him to eat well and rest, but they came back unopened, marked "Return to Sender." I told myself he was busy. Success demands time, after all. That's what I kept repeating every night as I ate dinner alone. Still, I never missed a birthday. Every year, I sent him a card with a few dollars inside, the same way my father once did for me. Whether he spent it or threw it away, I didn't care. I just wanted him to know I remembered him, even if he didn't remember me. When my health started failing, the doctors told me to slow down, to rest more, to let the young ones handle it. I laughed quietly. What young ones? The only young one I had was out there living a life I'd built for him, without ever looking back. There were nights I'd sit on the porch, staring down the empty street, pretending I could hear his footsteps returning. I'd picture him walking up with that same little boy grin, holding a bag of groceries, saying he came home to visit, but the road stayed empty. The house grew quieter each year. People in the neighborhood used to say, "You must be proud. Your son made it big." I'd smile and nod. I was proud that I raised someone strong enough to chase dreams, even if those dreams no longer had room for me. I told myself that my story was worth it, that every sacrifice a parent makes pays off in ways we can't always see. But deep down, I began to wonder, if success means forgetting the hands that built your ladder, what kind of victory is that? Still, I loved him. Every father does. No matter how far he drifted, my heart stayed where it had always been, waiting for the day he'd call, the day he'd say, "Dad, I'm coming home." But that day never came, not for a long time. And when it finally did, it wasn't in the way I expected. After my son's success took off, I noticed the small changes first. The phone calls became shorter, the tone more formal, like speaking to a stranger rather than a son. He used to call me every evening after work, telling me about his day, asking how I was feeling, making me laugh. But as the months went by, those calls turned into rushed conversations that always ended with, "I'll call you later," and that later never came. When I visited his apartment for the first time, I realized the distance between us wasn't just emotional. It was built into his new life. Everything looked perfect. Clean walls, glass tables, expensive furniture. But nowhere in that space did I see a single photo of us. Not one. I stood there, holding the small gift I'd brought him, a framed picture of his graduation day, and felt out of place, like a piece of the past that didn't belong in his future. He barely looked up from his phone as I talked. Every sentence I said felt like an interruption. I asked simple questions. "Are you eating well? Sleeping enough?" And got polite, empty nods in return. The warmth that once filled our home had been replaced with silence, the kind that comes when words no longer mean anything. I started to notice that he stopped inviting me to family gatherings or holidays. Thanksgiving came and went without a call. Christmas passed quietly, with only the hum of the old refrigerator keeping me company. I used to cook his favorite meal every year, just in case he walked through the door. But each time I ended up eating alone, staring at the empty chair across from me. When neighbors asked how he was doing, I forced a smile and said, "He's busy working hard." They'd nod, impressed, saying, "I must be proud." I was proud. I always would be. But pride doesn't fill the ache left by absence. I would have traded all his success just to hear him say, "I miss you, Dad." Sometimes I wondered if I had done something wrong, if my strictness when he was young had pushed him away. But deep down, I knew it wasn't anger or resentment. It was pride, the kind that comes when success convinces you you've outgrown the people who raised you. He had surrounded himself with friends who called him Sir instead of Son, and that seemed to be what he wanted. Still, I kept trying. I mailed letters with old photographs, hoping they'd remind him of the man who taught him how to ride a bike, how to shave, how to keep his promises. Each time the post office returned them unopened, my heart broke a little more. Eventually, I stopped writing, not out of anger, but exhaustion. You can only knock on a closed door so many times before you realize no one's opening it. I found comfort in small routines, watering the garden, fixing the fence, feeding the birds that came to my porch every morning. They didn't talk, but they kept me company. I told myself that love didn't need to be returned to be real, that a father's heart keeps giving even when no one's taking. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, loneliness crept in. I'd catch myself sitting at the dinner table, staring at the empty plate across from mine, wondering what he was eating that night, if he was warm, if he was happy. Then came the day I saw his name in the paper. Not for an achievement, but for bankruptcy. The business that had made him proud had collapsed. I didn't care about the money or the failure. I only cared that he might finally come home. But he didn't. Not even then. He vanished completely. No number, no address, nothing. And that's when I realized something painful, but true. Sometimes a parent loses a child not to death, but to distance, to a kind of forgetting that feels worse than dying. The day I learned my son's life had fallen apart began like any other. I was sitting on the porch with my morning coffee, watching the sun crawl up over the horizon, when I heard the neighbors murmuring across the fence. I didn't think much of it until I caught a name that froze me mid-sip, my son's. They were talking about a news story, something about financial collapse and unpaid debts. I went inside, turned on the old television, and there it was. His company's name flashing across the bottom of the screen, his photograph beside it. My proud, successful son, the one who once stood tall in tailored suits, was now the subject of public disgrace. I stared at that screen for a long time, unable to breathe. The reporter spoke of failed investments, of betrayal by business partners, of a man who had lost everything. But the worst part wasn't the fall itself. It was realizing he had gone through it alone. He hadn't called me, not even once. I tried to find him. I dialed his old number, but it was disconnected. I called friends who used to work with him, but they all said the same thing. He disappeared. It was like he had vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind nothing but rumors and debts. Some said he'd gone abroad. Others claimed he was hiding from creditors. I didn't know what to believe. For weeks I searched. I went through every contact I had, called every place I thought he might be. But the only thing that answered me was silence. Every night I sat by the window, watching cars pass, hoping one of them would stop at my gate. I kept the porch light on, the same way I had when he was a boy coming home late from school. That small glow was my way of saying, I'm still here. The loneliness grew heavier with each passing day. People stopped asking about him, and I stopped talking about him. It was easier to pretend he was busy than to admit he was gone. Not just from my life, but from himself. I had raised him to be strong, but I hadn't realized that pride could break a man faster than poverty ever could. One evening, I went to the local diner. The waitress, a kind woman who'd known my family for years, handed me an old newspaper. "You might want to see this," she said softly. There, tucked in the corner of the page, was a small article. A charity organization helping people who'd lost everything in business failures. And there was his name again. It said he'd been seen in shelters, moving from place to place, refusing help from anyone who recognized him. I folded that paper carefully and brought it home. I read it every night, hoping it would somehow change the next time I opened it. I imagined him out there, cold, hungry, proud, and too ashamed to come home. I blamed myself. Maybe I had raised him too well, taught him to be independent, to never ask for help, to never show weakness. Maybe I had built the very walls that now kept him away. I thought about the times he had fallen as a child. Every time I'd rush to pick him up, dust him off, tell him to try again. But this time, I couldn't reach him. The world was too big, and I was too old. Still, I prayed. Every night, I sat by my window, whispering his name like a prayer. I didn't ask for success or wealth for him anymore, only for him to find peace, wherever he was. I told myself that one day he'd walk back through that gate, maybe not as the man he once was, but as the boy I remembered. The boy who laughed, who dreamed, who still knew me as Dad. And then, one morning, years later, that prayer was answered, not with a knock on my door, but with something far stranger. I turned on the television again, this time expecting the morning news. But what I saw made my coffee cup slip from my hand and crash to the floor. There he was, my son, on TV. It was a cold morning, the kind that made the air feel heavy and still. I had been sitting in my chair, half watching the morning news, half thinking about how quiet life had become. The television flickered softly in the background, showing stories of charity events and community fundraisers. Then, as I reached for my cup of tea, something made me freeze. The camera panned across a group of people sitting in a small room. Tired faces, worn clothes, holding signs that said, "Help us get back on our feet." And then I saw him. My heart stopped. There, sitting among them, was my son. His face was thinner, his hair unkempt, but I knew those eyes anywhere. He was sitting on the floor, clutching a paper cup, and beside him a small cardboard sign read, "Please help. No family, no home." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I leaned closer to the screen, my vision blurring with disbelief. The reporter's voice faded into nothing as I stared, frozen between heartbreak and confusion. My own son, the boy I had raised, fed, loved, was sitting on live television begging for money, telling strangers he had no family. I turned up the volume. The reporter asked each person to share their story. When it was his turn, he lifted his head and said, in a shaky voice, "My father abandoned me years ago. I've been alone ever since." The words hit harder than any blow I'd ever felt in my life. My hand trembled so violently that the remote slipped and fell to the floor. The sound echoed through the empty room. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling as if the walls were closing in. I wanted to shout, to tell the world it wasn't true, that I had spent every day waiting for him, praying for him, keeping the light on, but no one could hear me. No one knew the truth. The world saw a poor man abandoned by his father, but I was that father, still sitting in the same chair, still keeping the same hope alive. The program ended, but I stayed there long after the screen went black. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, an old man holding a truth too painful to speak. The next morning, I tried calling the TV station. My voice shook as I told them I thought I recognized one of the men on their program. They gave me the name of the charity handling his case, and I wrote it down like it was the last thing keeping me alive. All day, I couldn't eat. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every few minutes, I replayed the moment in my head, the look on his face, the emptiness in his eyes, the words he said about being abandoned. It was as if life had looped the same heartbreak again and again, each time cutting deeper. The next day, I visited the charity center. The receptionist was kind, but her eyes softened when I said the man's name. "He comes in sometimes," she said gently, "but he doesn't talk much. We give him food when he shows up." She promised to call me if he returned. I left my number and sat outside the building for hours, watching people come and go. Every man who passed looked like him for a second, until they got closer and I realized it wasn't. Hope became a cruel trick of the light. Days turned into weeks. I went back every few days, carrying a small bag with clean clothes, some money, and a photo of us from when he was young. I told myself that if I saw him again, I wouldn't speak. I'd just hand him the photo. Something to remind him that he wasn't forgotten, no matter what he believed. And then, one evening, just as the sun began to set, I saw him. He was standing near the back of the shelter, his shoulders hunched, holding that same paper cup. He looked smaller somehow, like the world had been draining him bit by bit. I froze, unsure whether to move. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The son I once carried on my shoulders was now a stranger among strangers. I took one step forward, and my whole world began to tremble again. As I stood there watching him at the shelter, I realized the cruel truth. The boy I had once carried in my arms didn't recognize me anymore. His eyes, once filled with warmth and laughter, were now clouded with hunger and exhaustion. The same eyes that had once searched for me in a crowd now passed over me without pause. It felt like standing in front of a mirror that refused to reflect. I didn't call out to him right away. My heart was pounding too hard, and my throat felt dry. I just watched. Every movement, every breath he took was a reminder of the distance between who he was and what he'd become. I wanted to rush in, to wrap my arms around him, to tell him that no matter what had happened, I was still his father. But fear held me back. Fear that if I spoke, he would look at me and still not see me. He sat there, shaking slightly, clutching the cup of coffee someone from the shelter must have given him. The collar of his coat was torn, and his shoes were worn to the sole. I could see traces of the proud young man he had once been, the one who used to iron his shirts twice, who never left the house without polished shoes. But now, that pride had turned to dust. I stepped closer, but stopped when I heard him mumble to a volunteer. He was thanking her softly, saying she'd been kinder to him than anyone had in years. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence, and I had to turn away. It wasn't shame that made me move. It was pain, the kind that comes when love has nowhere left to go. Back home that night, I turned on the same television that had shown me his face for the first time in years. The charity re-ran the broadcast. I sat in darkness, watching him speak again. The same words, the same plea for help, the same broken tone. But this time, I wasn't angry at what he'd said about me. I understood it. When the world breaks you, sometimes you rewrite the story just to survive it. He had said, "My father abandoned me." Maybe in his mind I had. Maybe in those long, silent years, my absence had turned into proof of betrayal. Maybe every unopened letter I sent, every unanswered call, became a story he told himself. One where he was the victim, and I was the villain. I couldn't blame him. People see what pain lets them see. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, the glow of the television still in the next room, and tried to make sense of the years that had slipped between us. The man on the screen wasn't my enemy. He was my son, lost inside his own storm. And somehow, fate had made me watch it unfold from a distance I never asked for. I thought of all the things I'd said to him when he was growing up, about hard work, about honor, about never taking shortcuts. Maybe I'd been too hard on him. Maybe I'd expected him to carry strength when what he needed most was softness. Life has a cruel way of showing us our mistakes, not in words, but in what's left behind. I went back to the shelter the next day. I didn't tell anyone who I was. I just sat across the street watching him from a bench. People walked past him like he was invisible, like he'd become part of the city itself. Each passerby was another reminder of how easily the world forgets those who fall. At one point, he looked up and stared in my direction. For a brief second, our eyes met. My heart stopped. There was something there. A flicker, a pause, a hint of memory. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He looked away, lost again. I didn't move. I stayed there until he packed up and left, disappearing down a quiet alleyway. The rain started soon after, and I sat there alone, soaked and shaking, trying to hold myself together. He hadn't recognized me, but I'd recognized him. Every scar, every shadow, every broken piece. And maybe that was enough. Maybe love didn't need to be mutual to be real. That night, I promised myself something. I would find a way to bring him home. Not through force, not through guilt, but through grace. If the world had forgotten him, I would remember him enough for both of us. And so, the next chapter of my story began. The one where a father tries to rescue not just his son, but the love they both lost along the way. It took me another week to gather the courage to go back. Every night, I lay awake, replaying that moment. His face so close, yet so far away. His eyes vacant, but familiar. I knew I couldn't just keep watching from a distance. If I didn't try to reach him now, I might lose him forever. So one morning, before the sun rose, I packed a small bag. Inside, I placed a clean shirt, a sandwich, and an old photograph of us, the two of us fishing by the lake when he was 8 years old. That photo had been tucked in my wallet for over 30 years, worn at the edges, but it still carried our smiles. When I arrived at the shelter, the volunteers recognized me. They had seen me sitting outside before, waiting. One of them approached quietly and said, "He's here today," in the back, helping unload boxes. My heart leapt. I thanked her and walked slowly, my hands trembling so badly I had to hold onto the wall for balance. And there he was. He was standing near the back door, lifting a crate of canned goods, his posture tired but purposeful. His hair was longer now, streaked with gray, and his clothes hung loose around his thin frame. But it was him, my son. My heart felt like it would burst from my chest. I wanted to run to him, to hold him, to tell him I had been waiting for this moment for years. But I forced myself to move slowly. This time, I didn't want to scare him away. When I was close enough, I spoke softly. "Son, it's me." He froze. The box slipped slightly in his hands. He turned slowly, confusion written across his face. For a few seconds, he just stared, eyes narrowing, searching my features as if trying to place them. I could see his lips tremble, but no sound came out. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photo. "Do you remember this?" I whispered. He took it with shaking hands. His eyes scanned the picture, the small boy holding a fishing rod, his father behind him with an arm on his shoulder. I saw recognition spark like a flicker of light. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for a brief moment, time reversed. The tiredness in his face melted into something childlike, fragile, hopeful. Then the tears came, slow at first, then uncontrollable. He dropped the photo, covered his face, and began to sob. The sound tore through me. I stepped forward, wrapped my arms around him, and for the first time in decades, held him again. His body shook against mine as he cried, not just from shame, but from release. It felt like every unsent letter, every unanswered prayer, every long night apart was spilling out between us. We stood there for a long time, surrounded by the hum of quiet conversations and the soft clatter of volunteers working. The world around us continued, but for that moment, it felt like we were the only two people in it. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He told me he had lost everything, the business, his home, his friends. Said pride kept him from coming back. Said he couldn't bear to let me see him broken. He'd been living on the streets for years, surviving on small jobs and handouts, telling himself it was too late to make things right. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Every word he said was a knife, but I let it cut. Pain was part of the healing now. I told him I had never stopped waiting, that the porch light had stayed on every night, even when I thought I'd never see him again. His eyes widened, and then he cried harder. When he calmed down, I gave him the sandwich and the shirt from my bag. He stared at them for a long time before taking them gently, like fragile gifts. Then, for the first time, he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, trembling, almost broken, but it was enough. We sat outside the shelter for hours after that, not talking much. The silence between us wasn't painful anymore. It was healing. For years, silence had meant distance. Now, it meant understanding. When the sun began to set, I told him to come home with me. He hesitated, looking down at his hands. "I can't," he said softly. "Not yet." I didn't push, I just nodded and told him I'd be back tomorrow. As I walked away, I looked back once. He was standing there, holding the photograph in both hands, staring at it like a man trying to remember who he used to be. That image stayed with me long after I got home. My son, older, broken, but still mine. The next day, I went back. And the day after that, until, finally, he came with me. The next few days blurred together like slow-moving clouds. Each morning, I returned to the shelter, bringing warm food, clean clothes, and quiet company. My son rarely spoke, but he didn't turn me away. That was enough. I knew time was needed to heal what pride had shattered. On the fourth day, I found him sitting alone outside the shelter, staring at the ground. His hands were clasped together, his face lost in thought. I sat down beside him, the same way I used to when he was a child, after he'd made a mistake. We didn't speak for a while, just sat in silence as the city moved around us. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were red, but clearer than before. "Why did you come back?" he asked softly. The question wasn't cruel, it was confused, almost childlike. I took a deep breath before answering. "Because I never left," I said quietly. "You were lost. I just kept waiting for you to find the road home." He looked away, and I could see the shame rise in his shoulders. "I ruined everything," he murmured. "I didn't want you to see me like this. I said things I can't take back." I told him I knew, and I also knew that carrying guilt was heavier than carrying pain. He had punished himself enough. The world had already done its part to make him small. What he needed now wasn't another lecture. It was grace. He began to tell me everything, how he'd lost his job after his business partner betrayed him, how debts piled up until the house was taken, how he'd slept in cars, then under bridges, until shame kept him from calling home. He said there were nights when he almost did, when he'd found my number in his old phone but couldn't press dial. "I didn't think you'd want to hear my voice again," he said. I wanted to tell him I'd have given anything to hear that voice, that every day I'd waited by the phone, praying for it to ring. But I didn't interrupt him. He needed to let it all spill out, and I needed to hear it, all of it. When he finished, he looked at me with eyes full of tears and asked, "Can you forgive me?" For a moment I couldn't speak. The years of silence, the nights of wondering, the ache of thinking I'd lost him forever, all of it flooded back. But forgiveness isn't spoken, it's given. So I reached out and held his face in my hands, the same way I did when he was small. He leaned forward, and for the first time in decades, he cried on my shoulder. We stayed like that for a long time. No words, no anger, no explanations, just two souls finding their way back to each other. Later, I stood up and offered him my hand. "Let's go home," I said. He hesitated, looking around as if the city still held him prisoner. But then slowly, he nodded. The walk back was quiet. The streets were wet from last night's rain, and the air smelled like earth and hope. I glanced at him every few steps. His posture was straighter, his eyes softer. There was a lightness to his walk, fragile but real. When we reached my house, I unlocked the door and stepped aside, letting him go in first. He paused at the threshold, looking around as if stepping into another lifetime. The walls were lined with old photographs, birthdays, fishing trips, graduations, moments he thought I'd erased, but never could. He walked up to one picture, our favorite, taken the day he left for college. He smiled faintly. "You kept them?" he said. I nodded. I never threw away what still had love in it. He sat down at the kitchen table while I made coffee. For the first time in years, I heard his laughter, soft, uncertain, but there. It was like music I'd forgotten existed. As we sat together, I realized something. Revenge had no place in love. My pain didn't need to destroy him. It needed to free us both. What I wanted most wasn't to make him pay. It was to make him remember. Before he went to bed that night, he thanked me for not turning him away. I told him he didn't need to thank me. A father's heart never stops being a home, even when the door stays closed for years. When I turned off the lights, I looked at him one last time before heading to my room. He was asleep on the couch, the old fishing photo still in his hand. His chest rose and fell slowly, peacefully. For the first time in a long time, I felt the house breathe again. The days that followed were like waking up from a long, heavy sleep. My son stayed quiet most of the time, moving through the house like a man trying to remember how to live. He would sit on the porch in the mornings, sipping coffee, staring at the same garden where he'd once played with his toy trucks. Sometimes I'd catch him tracing the cracks in the wooden railing, the same ones his small fingers used to tap when he was learning to count. He didn't say much, and I didn't ask for words. The silence between us no longer felt empty. It was full, healing, alive. Every now and then, I'd hear him whisper to himself. I didn't listen in. Whatever he was saying, it wasn't meant for me. It was for the version of himself that had been lost all those years ago. One evening, while I was cooking dinner, I heard quiet sobs coming from the living room. I turned off the stove and walked in. He was sitting on the floor with an old photo album spread open before him, the one his mother had made before she passed. His face was buried in his hands. The photo on his lap was of the three of us on his 12th birthday, the year he got his first fishing rod. He looked up at me, eyes red and raw. "I wasted so much time," he said. His voice cracked on the word time. All those years I could have been here, and instead, I ran. I sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You came back," I said softly. "That's what matters." He shook his head. "But I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you." For a long moment, we just sat there, father and son, both broken in different ways, both trying to find forgiveness in the same air. I wanted to tell him that love isn't something you earn. It's something you give. But instead, I just pulled him closer. Sometimes silence speaks what words never can. He cried harder, years of guilt pouring out like floodwater. Between sobs, he spoke of the dark years, the loneliness, the mistakes, the pride that kept him from reaching out. He said he had built walls out of shame, brick by brick, until even he couldn't see himself anymore. Listening to him, I realized his punishment had already been served, not by me, not by the world, but by his own heart. That night, after dinner, he went to his room early. I stayed up late, sitting by the window, thinking about everything that had happened. The house felt different now. The emptiness that had once haunted it was slowly being replaced by the faint warmth of something fragile. Hope. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps. He walked into the kitchen, half asleep, and stood in the doorway. "Dad," he said, voice low, "thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled at him. "That's what fathers do," I said quietly. He nodded, wiped his eyes, and went back to bed. The next morning, I found a note on the table. Just a short one, written in his messy handwriting. "I'm going to make you proud again. I don't know how long it'll take, but I will." I folded the note and kept it in my shirt pocket. I still carry it there to this day. Over the next few weeks, he began rebuilding piece by piece. He started volunteering at the same shelter where he'd once asked for help. He said it reminded him of how fragile life could be, how easily one decision could change everything. I watched him transform, not into the man he used to be, but into someone better, someone humbler, gentler. There were still hard days, days when shame crept back in, when he'd sit in silence for hours. But this time, he didn't disappear. He faced it. One afternoon, I caught him fixing the fence in the backyard. He looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "It feels good to build again." In that moment, I realized something profound. Redemption doesn't erase the past. It rewrites it with truth. He was no longer the son who ran away. He was the man who came home. That night, as I turned off the lights, I whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. Not for the years we'd lost, but for the second chance we'd been given. Life rarely offers that, and when it does, it comes quietly, like forgiveness knocking at your door when you least expect it. The next morning, when I woke up, he was already outside feeding the birds. The same porch that had once symbolized waiting now looked like peace. And I thought to myself, maybe, just maybe, this was how love finds its way back. In the weeks that followed, life began to move differently, slower, softer, but filled with a sense of meaning that had been missing for years. My son was no longer the man who had once walked away from everything. He was someone rebuilding his life from the ashes of pride. And I, an old man who had once been left behind, was learning how to forgive without forgetting. He started helping around the house in quiet ways. Fixed the loose tiles in the kitchen, painted the faded fence, cleaned the garage that had been untouched since his mother's passing. Each nail he hammered, each brush stroke he made, felt like a silent apology. But I never asked for an explanation. I didn't need one. The work spoke louder than words ever could. Every morning, I would find him sitting on the porch, drinking coffee before me. Sometimes he'd talk about getting a small job again. Nothing big, just enough to start fresh. I could see determination in his eyes, the kind that doesn't come from ambition, but from redemption. He was tired of running from himself, tired of being lost. One Sunday, I woke up to find breakfast already made. Eggs, toast, coffee, simple but done with care. He smiled awkwardly and said, "I figured it was my turn." For a moment I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my throat tight. That one act, after all the years of distance, meant more to me than any apology ever could. Later that day, we took a walk through the park, the same one we used to visit when he was little. The benches were older now, and so were we, but the air carried the same peace. He told me he'd started volunteering again, helping others like him find work and food, said it felt good to do something that mattered. I smiled and told him, "That's how you start to rebuild your soul, by helping others carry theirs." He looked at me, and I could see something change in him. A spark of the boy he once was, buried deep, but still alive. That day, for the first time in decades, he called me Dad without hesitation. The months that followed brought more light into our lives. He found a steady job at a repair shop. He'd come home each evening smelling of oil and sweat, but with a smile I hadn't seen in years. He even began to laugh again, the kind of laughter that shakes the walls and fills the air with warmth. But the most beautiful moment came quietly, without fanfare. It was one evening when we sat together on the porch, the sky turning gold. He turned to me and said, "You know, I never thought I'd get another chance at life." "You gave it to me," I shook my head. "No," I said softly. "You gave it to yourself." I just left the door open. He smiled then, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes, and for the first time, I felt peace settle in my chest. The wound that had ached for years began to close. From then on, every week, we went together to the same shelter where we had found each other again. We cooked for the homeless, served food, handed out blankets. I watched him help others with the same gentleness I once used to raise him. It was like watching the boy I'd lost come back to life in the man he'd become. There were still nights when guilt crept back into his eyes, when he'd sit quietly, staring at nothing. But now, he didn't shut down. He talked to me about it, about regret, about hope, about the long road back. I told him that pain, when faced with honesty, becomes wisdom. He listened, and every time, he seemed to stand a little taller. One evening, as we finished serving at the shelter, he looked around at the people eating, smiling, surviving. And he said, "Dad, I think I finally understand what you meant by love." I didn't reply. I just placed a hand on his shoulder, because that was the moment I realized. The boy who had once lost everything had found himself again. When we went home that night, he turned off the porch light himself. For years, I had kept it burning, waiting for him to come home. But now, I didn't need to wait anymore. He was already there. Now, as I sit by the same porch where everything began, I think about how strange life can be. It gives you children to teach patience, then takes patience to teach you about love. My son sits across from me these days, reading the newspaper, sometimes humming the songs his mother used to love. There are wrinkles on his face now, not from age alone, but from the weight of learning. I see my younger self in his eyes sometimes, the same hope, the same regret. And in those quiet moments, I realize we both grew old, waiting for forgiveness. I often think back to the day I saw him on television, the day my heart broke for the second time in my life. I remember the sting of seeing him begging, the disbelief, the shame. But now, when I look at him, those memories don't hurt the same way. They don't sting. They whisper. They remind me that love can't be erased by distance or silence. It only gets buried under layers of pride, waiting for time to uncover it again. He's different now. There's a peace in him that wasn't there before, a gentleness that comes only after losing everything and learning what truly matters. He visits the shelter every week, not out of guilt, but gratitude. Says it reminds him where he came from and who helped him climb back up. Sometimes I go with him, standing in the background while he serves food, smiling as he greets strangers with kindness. I don't interrupt. I just watch, because watching him now feels like watching redemption unfold quietly in the middle of an ordinary day. I no longer carry anger in my chest. I used to think revenge was the only way to balance the pain, that showing him what he lost would teach him a lesson. But the truth is, love doesn't need an audience. It only needs a second chance. And when I saw him on that street corner, broken and forgotten, I realized the only revenge worth having was mercy. There are still nights when I lie awake, thinking about the years we lost, birthdays missed, words left unsaid, arguments that could have ended with a hug instead of silence. But then I remember that we found each other again, and that's what counts. The years of distance don't matter as much as the moments of peace we've gained now. Forgiveness doesn't rewrite the story, but it changes how it ends. Sometimes he apologizes again out of nowhere, as if the guilt never quite left. I always tell him the same thing. You came home. That's enough, and it is. Because in a world full of people who walk away and never return, the ones who find their way back deserve grace. The neighbors sometimes ask about him, curious, cautious. I just smile and say, he's doing fine. They don't need to know the details, the tears, the long road behind us. What matters isn't what happened, but what became of it. My son learned humility. I learned peace. Together, we learned that family doesn't disappear. It only waits for the right moment to heal. When I walk through the house now, it feels alive again. The air smells like coffee and fresh paint instead of dust and regret. The porch light, which once burned every night out of hope, now stays off because hope no longer needs a symbol. It's sitting right here beside me, breathing, smiling, living. Some evenings, we talk about the past, softly, like handling fragile glass. He asks if I ever stopped loving him. I tell him no, I couldn't. Even when he was gone, even when I thought I'd lost him forever, love doesn't have an off switch. It waits, like an old letter you're too scared to open but never throw away. Now, when I look at him, I see not the man who left, but the man who came back. That's the version I choose to remember. Because love, when it survives the worst, deserves to be remembered for its endurance, not its pain. Before I sleep each night, I whisper a quiet prayer, not asking for anything, just thanking life for bringing my son home before it was too late. I keep the photo of us fishing on the table beside my bed, right next to his note. I'll make you proud again. And he has. Not because of success or money, but because he learned what I always hoped he would. That being human means falling, breaking, and still finding the courage to start again. Final thought. He didn't recognize me on the screen that day, but he recognized my heart when he came home. Sometimes love doesn't vanish. It just waits until we're ready to remember it.